Warsaw, August 5, 1944. The city burns. Smoke rises in black columns over the Ochota district, a silent cathedral of flame above broken homes. The air trembles with the echo of gunfire, the metallic clatter of boots, and the crackling of wood that was once a street market. Through the haze, men in mismatched uniforms move like shadows. Some wear German SS tunics with Russian insignia crudely sewn beneath the skulls. Others, half-drunk, drag civilians from basements. Their language is not German. It is Russian, harsh, familiar to the ears of those they are killing. A woman clutches her child against a doorway. A burst of automatic fire ends the moment. The men laugh, stepping over bodies, looting rings, watches, even shoes. In their wake, the black sun of the SS glints from stolen caps, an emblem they neither earned nor understood. Among these men was a name whispered with dread: Bronislav Kaminski, an engineer turned warlord, a man who built his own army in the ruins of occupied Russia and sold it to Himmler. These were Himmler's Russian SS, the Kaminski Brigade, a force born from desperation, corruption, and betrayal. But before Warsaw, there was Lokot, and the beginning of a dark experiment. It began far from Warsaw, in the rolling forests and villages of Western Russia. When Operation Barbarossa tore into the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Wehrmacht advanced faster than any army in history. Behind them came the SS, not just soldiers, but engineers of a new order. Their mission was clear: cleanse, control, and reorganize conquered lands in the name of the Reich. In the chaos of collapse, entire regions fell into a strange vacuum. Soviet authority vanished. Red Army units retreated or were encircled. Villages burned, partisans formed, and in this broken landscape, the Germans sought collaborators, men who could maintain order, collect grain, and hunt resistance. One such corner of occupied Russia, near the town of Lokot, they found a man who seemed made for the role. Bronislav Vladislavovich Kaminski, born in 1899 in Vitebsk, was no soldier. He had been an engineer, educated, clever, and opportunistic. In the 1930s, he worked at a chemical plant, where he was once arrested for criticizing Stalin's collectivization policies. Released after a brief imprisonment, he carried a quiet hatred for the Soviet regime. When the Germans arrived in late 1941, Kaminski saw an opening not for ideology, but for power. Alongside another local, Konstantin Voskoboynik, he proposed a civilian administration that could run the region under German oversight. The occupiers, thinly stretched and desperate for stability, agreed. Thus was born the Lokot Autonomy, a rare experiment of German-approved self-rule under Nazi occupation. Here Kaminski found his empire. Under the banner of local self-government, he organized police, courts, and militia. He called his force the Russian Liberation National Army, the RONA. But it was liberation only in name. Its real purpose was to crush partisans, extract resources, and maintain order on behalf of the Reich. The Germans supplied weapons, captured Soviet rifles, machine guns, sometimes even tanks. In return, Kaminski's men provided security and manpower. They knew the forests, they spoke the language, and unlike German troops, they could move through villages without immediately drawing fire. But the line between order and terror blurred quickly. The RONA fought partisans with ruthless efficiency, burning villages, executing hostages, and seizing food from civilians. Reports from both German and Soviet sources described Kaminski's rule as brutal and corrupt. Looting became law. His officers enriched themselves while the countryside starved. Still, to the SS, Kaminski seemed useful. He controlled tens of thousands of square kilometers, maintained his own militia, and kept partisan activity lower than in neighboring regions. In Berlin, Heinrich Himmler took notice. By 1942, as the front lines began to shift, Himmler's attention turned toward creating ethnically flexible SS formations. The old idea of a purely Aryan elite was crumbling under the pressure of war. Manpower shortages were severe, and the Reich's ideology was bending to reality. Himmler dreamed of a greater SS, a multinational army loyal not to race, but to him. In the Lokot Autonomy, he saw a prototype. Kaminski's men already wore German-style uniforms. They took orders from SS officers and followed Himmler's model of paramilitary governance. The experiment seemed to work, a self-sustaining, anti-communist enclave in the heart of occupied Russia. Yet beneath the surface, rot was spreading. Kaminski's forces were undisciplined, driven by greed rather than ideology. Their liberation of villages often ended with massacres. German commanders in neighboring sectors complained about Kaminski's arrogance and his malicious behavior. But higher command, stretched thin and eager for results, looked the other way. By 1943, as the Red Army began pushing west, Kaminski's autonomy became a refuge for collaborators, criminals, and deserters. The line between soldier and bandit disappeared. Still, Himmler pressed on with his vision. He ordered the formal incorporation of Kaminski's force into the Waffen SS. Thus, the SS Sturmbrigade RONA was born, the first Russian formation to bear the black runes of Himmler's elite order. And with that transformation, a small corner of occupied Russia became a laboratory for one of the SS's strangest and darkest experiments, the creation of a Slavic SS. But even as Kaminski celebrated his new rank of SS Brigade Führer, the world around him was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing. The Lokot Autonomy would not last another year. The next chapter of Kaminski's story would unfold in retreat, a desperate march westward into Belarus, bringing his men and their crimes with him. By the spring of 1943, the German tide in the east was turning. The defeat at Stalingrad had shattered the illusion of invincibility. Soviet partisans grew stronger and bolder, cutting rail lines and ambushing convoys across the forests of Bryansk and Smolensk. In these regions, Kaminski's so-called autonomy began to suffocate under its own contradictions. The Lokot Republic had thrived in a vacuum when German lines were far ahead and Soviet counterattacks distant. But as the Red Army advanced westward, Kaminski's realm became a front line. His militia, once a regional police force, was thrown into large-scale anti-partisan operations, often side by side with German security divisions and SS police regiments. These were not clean battles. They were sweeps, Bandenbekämpfung, bandit fighting, a euphemism for annihilation. Entire villages were surrounded and burned. Anyone suspected of aiding partisans, even a loaf of bread shared, was shot. Men were hanged in the streets, women assaulted, homes stripped bare. German reports praised Kaminski's efficiency. But field officers noted the pillage that followed every operation. Civilians were robbed of livestock and valuables. German supply officers complained that RONA men stole their fuel and ammunition. Still, Himmler pushed forward. To him, Kaminski was not a bandit but a model. In early 1944, he ordered that the SS Sturmbrigade RONA be formally absorbed into the Waffen SS command structure. Kaminski, flattered by the attention, accepted without hesitation. He was given the rank of SS Brigade Führer, making him one of the few non-Germans to achieve such status. His men, numbering between 8,000 and 10,000, were now equipped with a hodgepodge of German and captured Soviet weapons, rifles, submachine guns, even a few light tanks. They wore field grey uniforms marked by the SS runes, yet many still carried their old Russian badges beneath them. To the true SS officers, they were an embarrassment, dirty, undisciplined, and unreliable. But Himmler saw something symbolic, the expansion of his Black Order into the East. The idea of a Russian SS was deeply paradoxical. Nazi racial doctrine viewed Slavs as inferior, fit only for servitude, yet the demands of war had forced the SS to compromise. Himmler justified it through twisted logic, claiming that under German guidance, certain racially valuable Russians could be redeemed through loyalty and bloodshed against Bolshevism. Kaminski became the poster figure for this ideological experiment. Behind the front, however, the illusion was collapsing. When the Red Army launched its Operation Bagration in June 1944, the entire German front in Belarus disintegrated. Kaminski's forces, stationed near Lepel and Orsha, were caught in the chaos. Thousands deserted. Others were slaughtered by Soviet troops and partisans seeking revenge for years of brutality. The Lokot Autonomy ceased to exist. Kaminski and the remnants of his brigade fled west with the retreating Germans. By July, they had reached Baranovichi, then Kaunas, finally regrouping in Lodz in occupied Poland. There, under SS supervision, the survivors, barely 3,500 men, were reorganized, rearmed, and placed under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Selewski, the man responsible for anti-partisan operations across the East. Von dem Bach was pragmatic. He needed manpower. Himmler needed propaganda. Kaminski's men were ordered to refit for a new assignment. Few knew what awaited them, the urban inferno soon to engulf Warsaw. By August 1944, the city was in open revolt. The Polish Home Army had risen against the occupiers, believing Soviet troops were near. The Germans, caught off guard, unleashed a furious counterattack. Himmler saw the uprising as an opportunity, not merely to crush resistance, but to destroy Warsaw itself, a symbol of Polish nationalism. He called for his most ruthless units, among them Durluanger's Penal Brigade, SS police battalions, and Kaminski's RONA. Himmler wanted terror, and Kaminski's men were experts in it. As the trains carrying the remnants of the Russian SS rolled toward Warsaw, witnesses described them as a mob, drunk, disorderly, loaded with looted goods and stolen livestock. Their officers were corrupt, their discipline non-existent. German regulars viewed them with contempt, yet within days they would become infamous even among the hardened killers of the Waffen SS. For Kaminski, it was the culmination of his ambitions, the chance to prove loyalty to Himmler and earn full recognition as a commander within the Black Order. For his men, it would be the beginning of their end. The fires of Warsaw would consume not just a city, but the very myth of Himmler's Russian SS. The human angle, Kaminski himself. Bronislav Kaminski was not a monster born. He was one shaped by circumstance, vanity, and opportunity. Before the war, he was a Soviet engineer, a man of intellect and discipline. But in the ruins of 1941, stripped of ideology and law, he became something else, a ruler without restraint. Unlike ideological collaborators such as Vlasov, Kaminski was not driven by politics. He was driven by power. His speeches spoke of Russian self-rule and freedom from Bolshevism, but his actions told another story. In Lokot, he ruled like a feudal lord, collecting taxes, seizing estates, and executing rivals under the guise of justice. German officers noted that he wore fine uniforms, drank heavily, and surrounded himself with mistresses, while villages under his command starved. Survivors described him as a man who confused cruelty for authority. He would inspect prisoners, decide their fate with a nod, and return to his office without a word. To his followers, he was untouchable, the only man who could speak to German officers as an equal. To the Germans, he was useful, a local tyrant who kept the countryside quiet. But the same qualities that had built his power would destroy him. His arrogance, his greed, and his blindness to the machinery of the SS would soon place him in a position even Himmler could no longer protect. 2. The tactical angle, German desperation. By 1943, the German military machine was bleeding men faster than it could replace them. The losses at Stalingrad, Kursk, and along the Dnieper forced commanders to turn to anyone willing to fight. Entire divisions were rebuilt using conscripts from occupied territories, Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, even Central Asians. Himmler's Waffen SS, once the symbol of racial exclusivity, became a patchwork of languages and loyalties. To sustain his empire within the Reich, he needed more than ideology, he needed bodies. Kaminski offered him exactly that, thousands of armed Russians already fighting partisans, already organized, already indoctrinated against Bolshevism. The SS bureaucracy quickly adapted. Kaminski's RONA brigade was restructured into German military frameworks, companies, battalions, regiments. German advisors were attached to improve discipline. In reality, the brigade remained what it had always been, a paramilitary gang in uniform. But tactically, they served a purpose. In anti-partisan warfare, the Germans preferred to let locals do the dirtiest work: house burnings, mass executions, cleansing operations. Kaminski's men knew the terrain, spoke the language, and could identify local resistance networks. They became the blunt instrument the Wehrmacht and SS needed to hold ground behind the front. Yet there was a fatal flaw. In relying on collaborators, the Germans imported chaos into their own system. Units like RONA operated with minimal oversight, often clashing with German garrisons and stealing supplies. Reports from Army Group Center complained of bandit-like behavior and loss of discipline among Russian auxiliary troops. But with the Red Army closing in, discipline was a luxury few could afford. In the end, Kaminski's brigade was both a tactical asset and a liability, an army built from desperation, sustained by plunder, and destined for collapse. The technological angle, tools of terror. Kaminski's men were poorly trained, but heavily armed. Their equipment was a strange fusion of two worlds, German precision and Soviet practicality. After the formal SS integration in 1944, RONA units received shipments of Karabiner 98K rifles, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, and even a handful of Stu-G III assault guns left behind from retreating Wehrmacht formations. But most of their arsenal remained Soviet: PPSH-41 submachine guns, DP light machine guns, and captured T-26 and BT-7 tanks. This hybrid arsenal reflected their identity, neither German nor Russian, neither regular army nor partisan. It also magnified their brutality. In anti-partisan warfare, firepower was not used for precision, but for punishment. Villages suspected of aiding resistance were shelled and torched. Entire columns of refugees were machine-gunned under the pretext of security operations. German documents from 1942-1943 note Kaminski's obsession with trophies, captured Soviet armor, repainted with German crosses and his own initials. His tank company was more theatrical than tactical, but it served a purpose: propaganda. Himmler showcased RONA as proof that even Russians could fight for the Reich's order. But the illusion of strength concealed decay. Weapons were stolen or sold on the black market. Vehicles broke down without maintenance. Ammunition disappeared between deliveries. The logistical rot mirrored the moral collapse of the brigade itself. By the time Kaminski's men were deployed to Warsaw in 1944, their arsenal had become a scavenger's collection, everything that could be looted, borrowed, or traded for vodka. Yet, when unleashed on a civilian city, this chaos became a storm. The weapons of two empires turned against the defenseless. And in that storm, the experiment of the Russian SS reached its most horrific expression. The fires of Warsaw were now waiting. But to understand what the Kaminski Brigade truly became in those streets, one must see them from other sides, through the eyes of their leaders, their enemies, and the crumbling moral world they inhabited. The leadership angle, Himmler's ideological gamble. Heinrich Himmler was, by 1944, a man torn between fanaticism and pragmatism. The dream of a racially pure SS, his black elite, was dying on the Eastern Front. The war he had promised Hitler to be one of racial cleansing and German destiny had turned into a desperate fight for survival. And so, in that desperation, Himmler began to rewrite his own rules. To sustain the SS's vast empire of divisions, police, and concentration camps, he opened the doors to foreign volunteers. At first, it was Western Europeans, Flemish, Dutch, Danes. Then, as German losses mounted, he turned east: Croatians, Ukrainians, Latvians, and Russians. Kaminski's RONA brigade became the most controversial of all. Here was a Slavic formation wearing SS runes, something unthinkable just 2 years earlier. But Himmler saw potential. He called Kaminski's experiment a model of Slavic anti-Bolshevik self-rule. In propaganda photos, he presented RONA as proof that even in the East, there existed people who could be reclaimed from the Asiatic Bolshevik chaos. Privately, however, SS officers were disgusted. Obergruppenführer von dem Bach-Seluski, who oversaw anti-partisan operations, described Kaminski's men as bandits in uniform. Reports from the SS main office accused them of robbery, drunkenness, and rape. Yet Himmler persisted, because to admit failure would mean admitting that his vision of racial dominance could not survive contact with reality. The RONA brigade was more than a fighting force. It was an ideological statement. It symbolized the SS's moral and intellectual collapse, a system so consumed by its own myth that it embraced its opposites to keep itself alive. By the time Kaminski's men reached Warsaw, that contradiction had become lethal. The enemy angle, the partisans, and the Red Army. To the Soviets, Kaminski's name became synonymous with betrayal. For the partisans operating in the Bryansk forests, the RONA Brigade was their most hated enemy, more feared than German police or security divisions. They knew the land, the dialects, and the faces. They were Russians killing Russians. Captured partisans told Soviet interrogators that Kaminski's troops would arrive in villages claiming to protect them from the Bolsheviks, only to rob them blind. Those who resisted were executed on the spot. Soviet reconnaissance reports from 1942-1943 listed Kaminski's band as a major anti-partisan force, noting its brutality and effectiveness. When the Red Army advanced in 1944, revenge followed. Dozens of captured RONA fighters were summarily executed. Others were turned over to the NKVD for public trials. Soviet propaganda labeled them traitors to the motherland, and posters warned that every collaborator will share Kaminski's fate. Yet even in German reports, there was fear. Wehrmacht officers stationed near RONA-controlled areas warned their superiors, their methods create more partisans than they destroy. Each burned village, each massacre, each act of plunder drove more civilians into the forests, swelling the ranks of the resistance that the SS claimed to be suppressing. Kaminski had built a machine of repression that fed its own enemies. By the time he fled west, his militia had become a symbol not of order, but of chaos, a force that embodied the self-destruction of Nazi occupation in the East. The moral angle, when survival becomes corruption. Every man in the RONA Brigade had a story. Some were opportunists, others prisoners of war offered a chance to live. Many were villagers who had lost everything, homes burned, families killed, caught between two brutal armies. For them, joining Kaminski's forces was not a choice of loyalty, but of survival. But in war, survival has a price. At first, they believed they were serving order, protecting villages, defending against partisans. Yet once looting began, once executions became routine, the line blurred. In the absence of law, morality dissolved into instinct. Drink, plunder, and power became the new currency. Witnesses after the war described RONA's camps as places of madness, where stolen goods were piled in barns, where officers competed over women taken from nearby villages. Kaminski rewarded cruelty and punished restraint. The more brutal a man was, the faster he rose in rank. This was not ideology, it was entropy, a system without control eating itself alive. The transformation was complete by the time they reached Warsaw. Men who had once served as local police were now predators. When confronted with civilians in revolt, they responded with what they knew best: terror. Moral collapse does not arrive all at once. It begins with a single compromise, a loaf of bread taken from a dead man, a burning house justified as punishment. Then, one day, there are no lines left to cross. Kaminski's brigade represented that descent, the complete corrosion of responsibility when war removes all restraint. By August 1944, that corruption was marching toward its final stage. The brigade had no homeland, no legitimacy, and no discipline. All that remained was its reputation, a reputation Himmler hoped to use one last time to turn the tide in Warsaw. The orders had been given. RONA was to enter the city and cleanse it. The result would shock even the SS. Warsaw, August 4, 1944, the uprising had begun. Across the city, Polish Home Army fighters struck at German garrisons, barricading streets, seizing weapons, and hoisting the white and red flag over the ruins. The revolt caught the occupiers off guard. Himmler's response was immediate and merciless. The city must be destroyed, he ordered. Every inhabitant killed. Warsaw is to be wiped from the face of the earth. To carry out this extermination, he assembled a force unlike any other: Durluanger's Penal Battalion, SS police units, and Kaminski's RONA Brigade. These were not frontline soldiers. They were men accustomed to terror, fluent in the language of reprisal. On August 5th, Kaminski's troops entered the Ochota district, a residential area on Warsaw's western side. German officers noted their arrival with unease. Their uniforms were filthy, their trucks overflowing with stolen goods. Many were already drunk. Their orders were simple: cleanse the area of insurgents and undesirables. Within hours, chaos consumed Ochota. Civilians were dragged from their homes, lined up against walls and shot. Hospitals were raided, patients bayoneted in their beds. Women were assaulted in cellars and courtyards. Entire families were executed for sheltering resistance fighters, sometimes without evidence. The Radium Institute, once a symbol of Polish science, was looted and burned. The Kolonia Lubickiego housing complex was turned into a makeshift camp, where thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or murdered. Witnesses recalled RONA soldiers laughing as they fired into crowds, taking souvenirs from the dead. German commanders observing the operation were horrified. Reports from the SS Police Regiment 23 described an orgy of violence that served no military purpose. Even Derluanger's men, infamous for their own atrocities, complained that Kaminski's troops were out of control. But to Kaminski, this was his moment. He saw the uprising as an opportunity to prove his loyalty to Himmler, to show that his Russian SS could match the cruelty of any German formation. He personally oversaw operations from a seized villa, holding drunken banquets while the city burned outside. When local SS officers protested, he ignored them. His men were his own, and Warsaw was his stage. For 5 days, the Ochota massacre raged unchecked. Estimates suggest 10,000 civilians were murdered by Kaminski's brigade alone. Survivors described the district as a wasteland of corpses, the air thick with smoke and the stench of death. German war photographers refused to document the scenes. Even hardened officers wrote in private diaries that the Russians have gone mad. Yet amidst the horror, something deeper was breaking, the illusion of discipline that had once shielded Kaminski from consequence. The SS prided itself on orderly brutality, terror in service of ideology. Kaminski's chaos violated that image. His men looted German supply depots, stole trucks, and murdered wounded soldiers for valuables. Himmler's Black Order could tolerate mass murder, but not theft from its own. Complaints began flooding headquarters. Von dem Bach-Seluski, now commanding all forces in Warsaw, demanded action. The brigade's behavior, he argued, was undermining the operation. Looted property meant for the Reich was being hoarded or sold on the black market. Himmler could not ignore it. Kaminski, drunk on his own impunity, believed himself untouchable. He boasted that Himmler had promised him a Russian SS division after the uprising, a new model army of Slavic volunteers. But his arrogance had crossed a fatal line. On August 19th, he was summoned to a meeting in Lodz. The pretext was administrative, a discussion about reorganization and rewards. Kaminski arrived with a small entourage, expecting recognition for his successes in Warsaw. Instead, he was arrested by SS officers under orders from the Reich Main Security Office. The trial was brief. The charges: looting, indiscipline, and theft of Reich property. The sentence: death. That night, Kaminski was shot in secret. His body was displayed to his own officers as proof of justice. To prevent unrest, the SS spread a false story that Kaminski had been ambushed and killed by Polish partisans. The man who had dreamed of leading Himmler's Russian SS died not as a martyr, but as an embarrassment, executed by the very system he had served. The purge did not end with him. Within days, German commanders began disbanding RONA units, absorbing some into police battalions, executing others outright. Yet fragments of the brigade remained in Warsaw, still killing, still looting, their command gone, their purpose now nothing but survival. The black sun of the SS had devoured one of its own, but the destruction it unleashed in Warsaw was far from over. When Bronislav Kaminski's body hit the ground that August night in Lodz, few among the SS mourned him. His execution was recorded quietly, without ceremony, another disposable pawn removed from Himmler's collapsing empire. But his death did not end the crimes of his creation. In Warsaw, The remnants of his brigade continued their rampage without command, conscience, or control. After Kaminski's arrest, the RONA soldiers remaining in the city were nominally placed under German police supervision. In practice, they were leaderless. Their officers argued, drank, and abandoned posts. Many refused orders entirely. The uprising had become their personal war, a campaign of looting and revenge against civilians who could not fight back. The Ochota district, once a densely populated residential quarter, was now a field of corpses. Columns of smoke hung over the ruins for days. Kaminski's men had established what survivors called the Camp of Death in the Zeleniak Market Square, an open area turned into a holding pen for civilians. Here, thousands were herded under the sun, without water or food, surrounded by armed RONA guards. Every few hours, groups were led away and shot. One German report from SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Barkselusk's staff recorded the situation with bureaucratic detachment. The Russian brigade has behaved in an uncontrolled manner. Looting and excesses continue despite repeated orders. Discipline no longer exists. Yet even this language could not capture the scale of what was happening. For the civilians of Warsaw, RONA had become a nightmare without ideology, a chaos machine unleashed by a system that had forgotten its own rules. By late August, the brigade had effectively disintegrated. Some units deserted outright, disappearing into the countryside. Others were reassigned to the Derluanger Brigade, another infamous formation composed of criminals and convicts. The integration was disastrous. The two groups fought among themselves, clashing over loot, women, and authority. One Derluanger officer later wrote, "The Russians were like wild animals, fearless, brutal, and uncontrollable. They plundered even from our wounded." When Himmler received the reports, his fury was cold and calculated. Kaminski had failed him, but Himmler's greater concern was image. The SS could not afford scandal, not when propaganda still portrayed its foreign volunteers as disciplined crusaders against Bolshevism. To erase the stain, he ordered the dissolution of the RONA Brigade. Surviving troops were to be reassigned, the unit's name struck from records. Official documents referred to it simply as disbanded due to losses. But the stain could not be erased. Photographs smuggled out of Warsaw by the Polish underground showed what RONA had done: burned streets, mutilated bodies, entire neighborhoods erased. The uprising would continue for 2 more months, but the Ochota massacre remained one of its darkest chapters. By September, what remained of the brigade, perhaps 1,500 men, was withdrawn from the city and sent to Slovakia and later Czechoslovakia, where they were ordered to fight partisans again. Few obeyed. Many deserted, others turned to banditry. Some eventually reappeared in Berlin in 1945, drafted into the city's final defense as cannon fodder. Kaminski's execution was officially explained as an accident. His portrait disappeared from SS archives. Himmler never spoke his name again. The Russian SS experiment was over. Yet its consequences lived on. In Warsaw, the ruins of Ochota became silent grave. After the Germans crushed the uprising in October 1944, survivors returning to the district found their homes looted, their families gone. Witnesses testified after the war that Kaminski's men had left behind piles of civilian corpses, women, children, the elderly, burned to hide the evidence. When Soviet forces entered the city in January 1945, they walked through streets that no longer existed. Out of a population of 1.3 million before the uprising, barely 150,000 remained. The rest were dead or deported. And somewhere in those ashes lay the last traces of the brigade that Himmler had once called his experiment in loyalty. The SS's attempt to manufacture obedience out of corruption had ended exactly as it began, in betrayal. Kaminski's men had betrayed their people, their masters, and ultimately themselves. The machine of terror that had elevated them had finally turned inward, consuming its own. The collapse of the RONA Brigade was not just a military failure. It was a moral implosion, the inevitable end of an ideology built on dehumanization. For the SS, the Kaminski affair became a lesson quickly buried in reports and euphemisms. But for the victims of Ochota, it was unforgettable. Their memory survived where Himmler's illusions could not. The fire of Warsaw marked the final turning point, not only for Kaminski's brigade, but for the entire myth of the invincible SS. Behind the symbols, behind the skulls and runes, there was nothing left but ruin. The city would burn for 63 days, but after the flames came silence and a reckoning. When the guns finally fell silent over Warsaw in October 1944, the city was no longer a city. It was a desert of ash and broken stone, its churches hollow, its streets nameless. The uprising had been crushed, the survivors deported or executed, and the name of Ochota entered history as a synonym for annihilation. For the RONA brigade, what followed was less victory than dissolution. Without Kaminski, the unit ceased to exist as a coherent force. Himmler, obsessed with appearances, ordered the official record altered, Kaminski's death attributed to a partisan ambush, his brigade redeployed to the rear for refitting. In reality, the experiment was dead. By September 1944, remnants of RONA had been scattered across the collapsing Reich. Some were sent to Slovakia, fighting briefly during the Slovak national uprising, where they continued their reputation for indiscipline and brutality. Others, under German control, were rebranded as combat support units, their SS insignia quietly removed. Those who survived long enough to reach Germany were absorbed into training battalions or police regiments, a bureaucratic burial. Himmler's foreign SS dream had turned to dust. His Russian SS, once intended as the nucleus of a Slavic anti-Bolshevik army, had proven uncontrollable, unreliable, and criminally degenerate. The Kaminski Brigade became an unspoken failure, an embarrassment that contradicted the SS's image of elite precision and ideological purity. Within the SS hierarchy, the handling of the affair revealed deeper fractures. Von dem Bach-Seluski, who had ordered Kaminski's execution, later used the case to distance himself from Himmler's racial policies during his post-war interrogations. He claimed that Kaminski's death was necessary to preserve discipline. Others in the SS called it what it was, a cover-up. The reality was more complex. Kaminski's excesses had simply made visible what the SS system already was, a machinery of power built on exploitation and dehumanization. In Warsaw, he had merely taken those principles to their logical extreme. For the men of RONA, retribution came in different forms. As the war's frontlines collapsed, some attempted to defect to the Western Allies, posing as forced laborers. Others, captured by the Red Army in 1945, faced the full weight of Soviet vengeance. NKVD tribunals labeled them traitors of the worst kind. Many were executed on the spot, others disappeared into the Gulag, their records sealed for decades. In Bryansk and Lokot, where the brigade had once ruled, Soviet commissions documented their crimes in chilling detail. Thousands of civilians murdered, villages destroyed, entire populations deported. Witness testimonies were collected for the post-war Extraordinary State Commission, forming part of the Soviet War Crimes Archive. To the survivors, the return of the Red Army meant liberation, but also silence. Talking about the Lokot Autonomy became dangerous. To acknowledge its existence was to risk being accused of collaboration. In the West, the Kaminski Brigade barely appeared in historical records. Allied war crimes investigators focused on more prominent SS formations, the Derluanger Brigade, Totenkopf, Das Reich. RONA's name faded. Hidden behind bureaucratic euphemisms like foreign volunteer units. Only fragments of German reports hinted at what had happened in Ochota, a few lines noting irregular conduct, losses, and reorganization. Himmler's empire was collapsing, but even as it fell, he continued to dream of rebuilding it, this time with new recruits, new volunteers, new experiments in loyalty. He refused to learn from Kaminski's failure. To the end, he believed that ideology could replace humanity, that obedience could be engineered from corruption. By the time the Red Army reached Berlin in April 1945, a few hundred former RONA soldiers remained alive. They fought in the ruins alongside stray SS men and Hitler Youth, defending a city that was already lost. Soviet soldiers who captured them rarely spared them. For many, their final punishment came without trial, in the rubble of the capital they had once looted. The black insignia of the SS, sewn by hand onto stolen uniforms, had become a death sentence. The war would end, but the shadow of the Kaminski Brigade and the lie of Himmler's Russian SS would not fade so easily. The post-war reckoning for the Kaminski Brigade was both concrete and symbolic. While Himmler and the SS attempted to erase its existence from official records, the damage, human, moral, and historical, could not be hidden. The atrocities committed by RONA in Warsaw, especially in Ochota, became part of the collective memory of survivors, chronicled in Soviet archives and eventually in the testimonies of Polish civilians. In Poland, the scale of destruction was staggering. Estimates suggest that the RONA brigade alone was responsible for 10,000 civilian deaths in Ochota, with tens of thousands more displaced. Entire streets were razed, homes looted, and hospitals destroyed. Survivors described the brigade's soldiers as indiscriminate killers, driven by plunder as much as ideology, and often indistinguishable from ordinary bandits in their cruelty. The memories of these massacres endured, forming a dark chapter in Warsaw's history. Soviet investigations, conducted after the liberation of Poland and Belarus, meticulously documented RONA's operations. Detailed reports catalogued killings, looting, and the systemic abuse of civilians. NKVD archives contained testimonies of captured brigade members, who often admitted their crimes under interrogation, revealing the breadth of Kaminski's reach. Many survivors remembered the names, the faces, the twisted uniforms, symbols of terror that embodied the failure of the SS experiment. In the West, attention was limited. Allied war crimes tribunals focused on German officers, but the complicity of foreign SS units like RONA was less widely prosecuted. Some members were apprehended and tried in Czechoslovakia or Germany, but many slipped into anonymity, absorbed into displaced persons camps or hiding among returning civilians. Their crimes, though documented, were often overshadowed by larger, more notorious SS formations. Historians today view the Kaminski Brigade as a cautionary example of what happens when ideology, opportunism, and brutality intersect. It was a force created for a purpose: anti-partisan warfare, urban repression, and the expansion of SS influence, but in practice, it became an uncontrollable engine of death. Himmler's dream of a Slavic SS failed catastrophically. What remained was chaos, both for the perpetrators and for the victims. Even in post-war Germany, traces of the brigade's men appeared in the collapsing Nazi infrastructure. A small number were absorbed into police units, while others fought in the desperate defense of Berlin in 1945, often facing certain death. Their final moments mirrored the trajectory of the brigade itself: violent, unstructured, and ultimately futile. The legacy of the brigade extends beyond statistics and records. It illustrates the moral bankruptcy inherent in collaboration and the perversion of military and political authority. Kaminski's rise and fall showed how personal ambition, when aligned with an oppressive regime, can magnify atrocities exponentially. Himmler's willingness to gamble with loyalty, ideology, and racial doctrine created not an army, but a symbol of moral collapse. For Warsaw, Ochota, and the villages of Bryansk, the aftermath was silence, rubble, and grief. For historians, it became a case study in how power, when exercised without accountability, results in total corruption, a warning of how easily wartime desperation can transform ordinary men into instruments of terror. The Kaminski Brigade had been destroyed, its leader executed, and its name erased from SS records, but its crimes remained undeniable. In the streets of Warsaw and the forests of Lokot, memory survived where bureaucracy had attempted to obliterate it. The stage was now set for reflection. The story of Kaminski, his men, and Himmler's ambitions is not merely about military operations, but about the human capacity for cruelty when ideology and desperation collide. The story of Bronislav Kaminski and his Russian SS brigade is a stark reminder of how war can distort morality, ambition, and loyalty. From an engineer in the forests of Western Russia to the commander of a paramilitary force branded with the black insignia of the SS, Kaminski's rise was fueled less by ideology than by opportunity, and his fall by the same forces he had unleashed. Himmler's experiment with a Slavic SS force reveals a chilling truth. Ideology, no matter how rigidly enforced in theory, can be bent when survival or expedience demands it. The Kaminski Brigade embodied this contradiction. Formed under the banner of anti-Bolshevism and loyalty to the Reich, it became a machine of plunder, murder, and moral collapse. In the chaos of war, Himmler's vision collided with reality, producing not an army but a self-destructing entity whose cruelty rivaled its own masters. Warsaw, particularly the Ochota district, stands as a testament to the human cost of that collapse. Thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, died not on a battlefield, but under the control of men who had abandoned every principle except survival and greed. The brigade's legacy is not measured in strategic victories, but in the lives destroyed and the communities shattered. Yet there is a lesson beyond horror. The Kaminski Brigade illustrates the dangers of unchecked power and the perversion of military authority when it is divorced from accountability. It shows how ordinary individuals can be transformed into instruments of terror when ideology, ambition, and opportunity converge. It is a cautionary tale of human weakness under the weight of war, and of the consequences when leaders like Himmler gamble with loyalty, morality, and life itself. In the end, Kaminski's insignia, his black SS runes, and even his name could not survive the collapse of the system that created them. But the memory of the atrocities remains, a historical witness to the darkness humans are capable of when ideology and impunity reign. The ruins of Warsaw, the forests of Lokot, and the silent testimonies of survivors remind us that history does not forgive those who surrender conscience to ambition. The Kaminski Brigade is gone, but its lessons endure, a somber echo of the human cost of power wielded without restraint.